this. And
Ooh.
wow, gambling on his passed pawns here, Hans Niemann.
So that was the reaction of Lawrence Trent and David Howell when Hans Niemann took this big risk in round 4 of the Blitz World Championship. But would it pay off for him or would it backfire? Well, let's have a look. He had white here playing against Petrosian from Armenia. He kicks off with pawn to d4. We had knight f6, c4, e6, and now knight c3 from Hans. He invites a mainline Nimzo-Indian, which his opponent plays. And now he goes e3, which is the main move here, and black goes d5, immediately striking at the centre, and now a3 from Hans puts a question to that bishop. It takes on c3, giving up the bishop pair, but gaining more control over e4. Now Hans has made his bishop look really miserable playing this kind of opening, but he's soon going to bring it this way. He'll unravel the position. c6 now from black, not forced. You can go castles there, for example. It's a slightly more flexible move. Keep c5 in the air, but this one's not bad. And after bishop d3, we now see b6, which is a common positional idea, because this is a bad bishop looking at its own colour pawns, and so black wants to bring it out like this and exchange it for this one. Knight e2 now from Hans, flexible move. Maybe the f-pawn moves later, also covers this c-pawn for now, and we see bishop a6, and due to the pressure on c4, that one now takes here, the bishops are exchanged, queen recaptures, and now which pawn should you take with here? What's the best positional decision to make? Well, the answer to that one is c takes on d5, because you free a square for the knight to potentially come to, and you now open up this file to pressure this backwards pawn potentially. And white can already go c4 here actually to liberate that pawn. It is a decent move, but Hans instead holds off. He castles the king, and now queen c8 puts a stop to c4. We see a4 from Hans preparing to develop the bishop. Black castles, the bishop comes, rook e8 played. This rook comes to the c file, and now this next move is a bit hasty from black. So knight c6 is actually best, because if c4 comes, well then there's this nice queen to a6 move. The pawn is pinned, otherwise you're dropping your queen, and white still keeps a small edge, but black's unraveling quite nicely. But what we see in the game was queen a6 immediately. And the problem with this is you're going to kind of put this knight offside now. So Hans could have taken immediately. He didn't do this. And after knight recaptures, he can go pawn c4, and he's just a bit better because this knight's a bit clumsy. He's the first to the file, which is about to open. This bishop's also a bit nasty. But instead he goes queen b5, also a good move, and the idea of this one is that if black takes, pawn recaptures, well you've got a really nice bind on these squares, the knight's not coming there, and you're going to get long-term pressure against this pawn. So we didn't see captures. Rook c8 played, prevents this pawn to c4 push. And now bishop d6 from Hans, interesting idea. So he's threatening to capture this knight, which is defending the queen, and therefore it would force this queen to capture on b5 and create that bind I talked about. But there's a brilliant response here, which perhaps Neiman overlooked, which is knight to e4, which was played. And now if you take the knight, the problem this time is that after queen captures, pawn captures, rook takes, you can't play the move you want, which is pawn c4, because then knight d2 comes, and there's a double threat. You're threatening to win the pawn on c4, but also fork the rooks and win the exchange. So the best now for white is to take, give that exchange, you get a line something like this, black is better. Not what you want. So because of that threat, the bishop now just drops back to f4, and the best move for black was to still go knight d2, transfer the knight into c4 as I'm highlighting here, but instead we see takes, not the best, a bit hasty, pawn recaptures, and then a5. And black's idea after captures here, rook captures, is that you're liquidating some pieces, should be steering this towards a drawish position. But Hans gets an initiative now, because he can kick this knight with f3. You can't take here, of course, so the knight hops to d2, but now after rook a1, hitting this knight, rook defends, we get pawn to e4, opening up a backwards attack on that knight, and after it hops away to c4, Hans takes, pawn recaptures, and he's just got a comfortable edge now, because these pawns are split, they can be targeted. He's also got the pressure here, and he's got the bishop, which tends to do well when you've got pawns sort of split all over the board. So the bishop drops back to g3, clears f4 for the knight to target this pawn. So g5 was played, stops that idea. That's why knight c1 now came instead, looking to come into d3, where it can then eye this square or this square, and now black hops back, breaks this uncomfortable pin, and you don't have time to take this knight with the bishop because then you lose your rook on a1. So the rook captures here, knight recaptures, and now we see this one hopping in, continuing its journey, pawn to b5, and h4 from Hans now just gets rid of a pair on the queen side, king side rather. We see this exchange, knight b4 targets this pawn, this one defends, and now bishop c7 is a bit of a pseudo threat, because although you could eliminate this knight in a moment, which is defending the pawn, it can just be recaptured by the other one, and then you'd still be defending. And long story short, this position's now very level, so we get pawn f6, king f2, king f7, and now we see a lot of shuffling for a lot of moves. So this is a very long game, over 100 moves. So I'm going to fast forward some moves here to get some key positions. So the pieces just shuffle around here. Hans does change the pawn structure on the king side, and he soon gains some space there, as we'll see. So he brings this pawn all the way to f5, checks the king, fixes these one on dark squares. So if he can ever get the bishop in behind, that will be good. But black's doing a solid job, just holding on, and now liquidating that b pawn. The king sidesteps, and now the knight hops back, pressuring this pawn, and here Neiman makes an endgame mistake. But if he'd used the sponsors of today's video, Aimchess, he maybe wouldn't have made this exact endgame mistake, because what Aimchess will do is pull in your game data from Lichess or chess.com, absolutely free by the way. It's free to sign up, free to pull in the data. You get a free scouting report, and it will show you where your biggest weaknesses are. Endgame, opening, etc., tactics, and then it will pull together a tailored training plan that you can use from there. And of course, the best features come if you sign up for a premium account, and then you can use the code down below, EPIC at checkout, to get a good discount, and I absolutely love it. I've already seen the difference in my own games this season, so do check that one out. But back to Neiman here. So after this knight c6 move, the pawn is pressured, and you have to keep this square free for the king to stay with the defense of it. But what we see is knight d3 played, and now this knight can hop back. It threatens this fork of bishop and king, and so after this one moves away, we then see the knight hopping here with check. But there's no king d3 as mentioned, no king c4, the pawn covers that square. So the king has to go, the pawn drops. Black is now clearly better, but Neiman does do a good job of holding on here. So he hops the knight back to f2, and again we're going to start skipping through some moves. This is a long game, but what Neiman does well is keep the king in front of the pawn and then create threats with his dark squared bishop against these pawns which are on dark squares. So we get a lot more shuffly moves. Black struggles to bring the king round here, and what we're going to see is that when the king does try and come round, well then Neiman creates counterplay. So now it comes to c6. Bishop e7 hits this pawn. Now the knight's backpedaling, and this knight comes to d3, threatening to check and pick up this pawn. Knight b3 check played, king c3, the knight now goes and Neiman checks, and we see black getting into the same bind which Neiman got into just a moment ago, where he can't actually stay with the pawn because the knight stands in the way, the bishop covers this square. So the king goes, the pawn drops, and now a second pawn is dropping on f6. So black goes for counterplay, looking at this pawn, but the knight takes, holds this pawn. King comes back, king d4, and what we're going to see in a moment is that Neiman gives up his bishop and then tries to win this knight and pawn endgame with the extra pawn. Now, the knights start dancing. We're coming to the moment of a key sacrifice that stunned David Howell. This is the final moves now, and what Hans does here is try and decoy this king away from the protection of the passed pawn, and black falls for it. King to c5 is played, going after this knight, but you see the eval bar shoot up. This is a blunder. What's the winning move in this position? So the way you should play is king to e5, and Neiman finds it, but after black takes the knight, we see the pawn kicking on. Now, you don't want to be taking immediately. This endgame is then completely lost. But what you can do is come here, just hold off on it a moment, also threaten check and then winning this pawn. And Neiman now goes wrong in serious time pressure. What he should do is king to e6 to shepherd this pawn home, because black can't take here or the pawn goes, that's completely lost. And if you bring the king, just whoops here, bring the king, just waiting a moment, well then there's f7, knight takes, king takes, and this is perhaps the detail that Neiman missed, that this pawn endgame is winning, because black can cover the pawn for a moment, but then the king finds a square here. This king has to give ground, the pawn drops, and this one's going to run through completely unopposed. So Neiman should go king e6, wins the game, but he goes king e4, and look at the eval bar go, it's completely lost now. Now, not if you take here. Then the pawn's running, and actually this should be a draw with check, king, knight goes, king comes, and this one would lead to a draw. So you don't take on g4 immediately in this position, but what you do instead is wait with the king. We see king c3 with the idea to just march around and collect this pawn. And you can't shoulder this king out of the position or this one drops with check. This is the problem. So because you can't go king e3, Neiman comes this way, but here comes the black king. And again, we go into an endgame, which is just hopeless for Neiman. The pawn drops, the king comes. And although you can come here for a moment, attack this pawn, after black takes here, well, this endgame is once again completely lost. If you want to see another shocking move that Neiman played in a recent tournament, then check out this video on screen. Thanks for watching and see you soon.